The official line goes something like this. Russia is challenging NATO and the international rules-based order by threatening to invade Ukraine, and the Biden administration needed to deter Russia by providing more security guarantees to the Zelensky government. The official account seizes on Russia's 2014 annexation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula as a starting point for the U.S.-Russian relations, and is evidence of Putin's goals of rebuilding Russia's long-lost empire. Russia's demand that NATO cease its expansion to Russia's borders is viewed as such an obvious and possible demand that it can only be understood as a pretext to invade Ukraine. Therefore, the U.S. should send weapons and troops to Ukraine and guarantee its security with military threats to Russia. The Washington Post asked, why is there tension between Russia and Ukraine? Its answer. In March of 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. A month later, war erupted between Russian allied separatists and Ukraine's military in eastern Ukrainian regions of Donbass. The United Nations Human Rights Office estimates that more than 13,000 people have been killed, but that account is highly misleading because it leaves out the crucial role the U.S. has played in escalating the tensions in the region. In nearly every case that we looked at, the reports omitted the U.S. extensive role in 2014 coup that preceded Russia's annexation of Crimea. Focusing on the latter part only serves to manufacture consent for U.S. intervention abroad. Okay, so the headline. The West wants investor-friendly policies in Ukraine. The backdrop of the 2014 coup and annexation cannot be understood without looking into the U.S. strategy to open Ukraine markets to foreign investors and give control of its economy to giant multinational corporations. A key tool for this has been the International Monetary Fund, which leverages aid loans to push governments to adopt policies friendly to foreign investors. The IMF is funded by and represents Western financial capital and government and has been at the forefront of efforts to reshape economies around the world for decades, often with disastrous results. The civil war in Yemen and a coup in Bolivia both followed a rejection of IMF terms. In Ukraine, the IMF had long planned to implement a series of economic reforms to make the country more attractive to investors. These included cutting wage control, i.e. lowering wages, reforming and reducing health and education sectors, which made up the bulk of employment in Ukraine, and cutting natural gas subsidies to Ukraine citizens that made energy affordable to the general public. Coup plotters like U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland reportedly stressed the need for the Ukrainian government to enact the necessary reforms. In 2013, after early steps to integrate with the West, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych turned against these changes and ended trade integration talks with the European Union. Months before his overthrow, he restarted economic negotiations with Russia, in a major snub to the Western economic sphere. By then, the nationalist protests were heating up that would go on to topple his government. After the 2014 coup, the new government quickly restarted the EU deal. After cutting heating subsidies in half, it secured a $27 billion commitment from the IMF. The IMF's goal still included reducing the role of the state invested interest in the economy in order to attract more foreign capital. The IMF is one of the many global institutions whose role in maintaining global inequities often goes unreported and unnoticed by the general public. The U.S. economic quest to open global markets to capital is the key driver of international affairs. But if the press chooses to ignore it, the public debate is incomplete and shallow. Headlines: The U.S. helped overthrow Ukraine's elected president. During the tug-of-war between the U.S. and Russia, the Americans were engaged in a destabilization campaign against the Yanukovych government. The campaign culminated with the overthrow of the elected president in the Maidan Revolution, also known as the Maidan Coup, named for the Kiev square that hosted the bulk of the protests. As political turmoil engulfed the country in the lead-up, the U.S. was fueling anti-government sentiment through mechanisms like USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, just as they had done in 2014. In December 2013, Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and a longtime regime change advocate, said that the U.S. government had spent $5 billion promoting democracy in the Ukraine since 1991. The money went towards supporting senior officials in Ukraine government, members of the business community, as well as opposition civil society who agree with U.S. goals. Okay, so the NED is a key organization in the network of American soft power that pours $170 million a year into organizations dedicated to defending or installing U.S.-friendly regimes. The Washington Post, David Ignatius, once wrote that the organization functions by doing in public what the CIA used to do in private. The NED targets governments who opposes U.S. military or economic policy, stirring up anti-government opposition. The NED board of directors includes Elliot Abrams, whose sordid record runs from the Iran-Contra affair in the 80s to the Trump administration effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government. In 2013, NED President Carl Gershman wrote a piece in the Washington Post that described Ukraine as the biggest prize in the East-West rivalry. After the Obama administration, Nuland joined the NED board of directors before returning to the State Department in Biden's administration as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. One of the many recipients of the NED money for projects in Ukraine was the International Republican Institute, the IRL, once chaired by Senator John McCain, has long had a hand in U.S. regime change operations. During the protests that eventually brought down the government, McCain and other U.S. officials personally flew into Ukraine to encourage protesters. I don't know if you guys remember the Lindsey Graham and McCain going down there, and they did just that. Headlines: U.S. officials were caught picking the new government. On February 6, 2014, an anti-government protests were intensifying. On February 6, 2014, as the anti-government protests were intensifying, an anonymous party, assumed by many to be Russia, leaked a call between Assistant Secretary of State Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Geoffrey Pyatt. The two officials discussed which opposition officials would staff a prospective new government, agreeing that Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Nuland referred to him by the nickname Yats, should be in charge. It was also agreed that someone high-profile to be brought in to push things along, that someone was Joe Biden. Weeks later, on February 22nd, after a massacre by suspicious snipers brought tensions to a head, the Ukrainian parliament quickly removed Yanukovych from office in a constitutionally questionable maneuver. Yanukovych then fled the country, calling the overthrow a coup. On February 27th, Yatsenyuk became prime minister. At the time the call leaked, media were quick to pounce on Nuland's saying, "Screw the EU." The comment dominated the headlines. While the evidence of U.S. regime change efforts was downplayed with the headlines, "Russia claims U.S. is meddling over Ukraine," the New York Times put the facts of U.S. involvement in the mouth of an official enemy, blunting their impact on the audience. The Times later described the two officials as benignly talking about the political crisis in Kiev and sharing their views on how it might be resolved. The Washington Post acknowledged that the call showed a deep degree of U.S. involvement in affairs that Washington officially says are Ukraine's to resolve, but that fact rarely factored into future coverage of U.S.-Ukraine-Russia relationship. Headline: Washington used Nazis to help overthrow the government. The Washington-backed opposition that toppled the government was fueled by far-right and openly Nazi elements like the Right Sector. One far-right group that grew out of the protests was the Azov Battalion, a paramilitary group of neo-Nazi extremists. Their leader made up the vanguard of the anti-Yanukovych protests and even spoke at opposition events in the Maiden alongside U.S. regime change advocates like McCain and Nuland. After the violent coup, these groups were later incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces, the same armed forces that the U.S. has now given $2.5 billion, though Congress technically restricted money from flowing to the Azov Battalion in 2018. Trainers on the ground say there's no mechanism to actually enforce the provision. Since the coup, the Ukrainian nationalist forces have been responsible for a wide variety of atrocities in the counterinsurgency war. Far-right influence has increased across Ukraine as a result of Washington's actions. A recent UN Human Rights Council has noted that fundamental freedoms in Ukraine have been squeezed since 2014, further weakening the argument that the U.S. is involved in the country on behalf of liberal values. Among American neo-Nazis, there's even a movement aimed at encouraging right-wing extremists to join the battalion in order to gain actual combat experience in preparation for a potential civil war in the U.S. Did you hear that? Wow. In a recent UN vote on combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, the U.S. and the Ukraine were the only two countries to vote no. As FAIR has reported, between December 6, 2021 and January 6, 2022, the New York Times ran 228 articles that refer to Ukraine, but none of them reference the pro-Nazi elements in Ukraine politics or government. The same can be said of the Washington Post 2001 articles on the topic. Headlines: There's a lot more to the Crimean annexation. The facts above give more context to Russians' actions following the coup and ought to counter the caricature of a Russian empire bent on expansion. From Russia's point of view, a longtime adversary had successfully overthrown a neighboring government using far-right extremists. The Crimean Peninsula, which was a part of Russia until it was transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954, is home to one of two Russian naval bases with access to the Black and Mediterranean Seas. One of the history's most important maritime theaters, and Crimea, controlled by a U.S.-backed Ukrainian government, was a major threat to Russian naval access. The peninsula, 82% of whose households speak Russian and only 2% mainly Ukrainian, held a plebiscite in March 2014 on whether or not they should join Russia or remain under the new Ukrainian government. The pro-Russian camp won with 95% of the vote. The UN General Assembly, led by the U.S., voted to ignore the referendum results on the grounds that it was contrary to Ukraine's constitution. The same constitution was set aside to oust President Yanukovych a month earlier. All of this dropped from Western coverage. The U.S. wants to expand NATO. In addition to integrating Ukraine into the U.S.-dominated economic sphere, Western planners also want to integrate Ukraine military. For years, the U.S. has sought the expansion of NATO, an explicitly anti-Russian military alliance. NATO was originally billed as a counterforce to the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, but after the demise of the Soviet Union, the U.S. promised the new Russia that it would not expand NATO east of Germany. Despite this agreement, the U.S. continued building out its military alliance, growing closer and closer to Russia's borders and ignoring Russia's objections. This history is sometimes admitted, but usually downplayed in corporate media. In an interview with the Washington Post, Professor Mary Soro, author of Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-War Stalemate, recounted that after the Soviet collapse, Washington realized that it could not only win big, but win bigger. Not 1 inch of territory needed to be off limits to full NATO membership. The U.S. all-or-nothing approach to expansionism maximized conflict with Moscow, she noted. One interview does little to cut through the drumbeat of pre-NATO talking points. In 2008, NATO members pledged to extend membership to Ukraine. The removal of the pro-Russian government in 2014 was a giant leap towards the pledge becoming a reality. Recently, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg announced that the alliance stands by plans to integrate Ukraine into the alliance. Bret Stephens in the New York Times maintained that if Ukraine wasn't allowed to join the organization, it would break the spine of NATO and end the Western alliance as we have known it since the Atlantic Charter. Headlines: U.S. wouldn't tolerate what Russia is expected to accept. Much has been written about the Russian buildup and Ukrainian border. Reports of the buildup have been intensified by U.S. intelligence officials warning of the attack. Media often echo the claim of the inevitable invasion. The Washington Post editorial board wrote that Putin can and will use any measures that the United States and its NATO allies either take or refrain from taking as a pretext for aggression. But Putin has been clear about a path to de-escalation. His main demand has been for direct negotiations to end the expansion of the hostile military alliance to his borders. He announced, "We have made it clear that NATO's move to the east is unacceptable and that the United States is standing with missiles on our doorstep." Putin asked, how would Americans react if missiles were placed at the border of Canada or Mexico? In corporate media coverage, no one bothers to ask this important question. Instead, the assumption is that Putin ought to tolerate a hostile military alliance directly across his border. The U.S., it seems, is the only country allowed to have a sphere of influence. The New York Times asked, can the West stop Russia from invading Ukraine, but shrugs at the U.S. dismissal of Putin's terms as non-starters. The Washington Post reported some analysts have expressed worry that the Russian leader is making demands that he knows Washington will reject, possibly as a pretext for military action once he is spurned. The Post quoted one analyst, "I don't see us giving them anything that would suffice relative to their demands, and what troubles me is that they know it." Audiences have also been assured that Putin's reaction to Western expansionism is actually a prelude to more aggressive actions. Ukraine is the only one small part of Putin's plans, warned the New York Times. The Times later described Putin's Ukraine policy as an attempt at restoring what he views as Russia's rightful place among the world's great powers. Rather than an attempt to avoid having the U.S. military directly on its border, USA Today warned readers that Putin won't stop with Ukraine. But taking this view is diplomatic malpractice. Anatol Levin, responsible statecraft, an analyst at the Quincy Institute, wrote that U.S. acquiescence to a neutral Ukraine would be a golden bridge, that in addition to reducing U.S.-Russia tensions, could enable a political solution to Ukraine's civil war. This restraint-oriented policy is considered fringe thinking in the Washington foreign policy establishment. The memory hole. All of this missing context allows hawks to promote disastrous escalations of tensions. The Wall Street Journal published an opinion piece trying to convince readers there was a strategic advantage to risking war in Ukraine. The piece by John Denai of the U.S. Army War College summarized the familiar hawkish talking points and claimed that a neutral Ukraine is an is anathema to Western values of national self-determination and sovereignty. In a modern rendition of Afghan Trap, Denai asserted that war in Ukraine could actually serve U.S. interests by weakening Russia. Such a war, however disastrous, would forge an even stronger anti-Russian consensus across Europe. Refocusing NATO against the main enemy result in economic sanctions that would further weaken Russia's economy and sap the strength and morale of Russia's military while undercutting Mr. Putin's domestic popularity, thus escalating tensions and a win-win for Washington. A few of the recent wave of Ukraine pieces recount the crucial history given above, including the truth about U.S. foreign policy goals in the post-war era, makes the current picture look a lot less one-sided. Imagine for a second how the U.S. would behave if Putin began trying to add a U.S. neighbor to a hostile military alliance after helping to overthrow its government. The economic imperative for opening foreign markets, the native drive to push up against Russia, U.S. support for 2014 coup, and the direct hand in shaping the new government all need to be pushed down the memory hole if the official line is to have any credibility. Absent all of that, it is easy to accept the fiction that Ukraine is a battleground between a rules-based order and Russia autocracy. Indeed, the Washington Post editorial board recently compared negotiating with Putin to appeasing Hitler at Munich. It called on Biden to resist Putin's trumped-up demands on Ukraine, lest he destabilize all of Europe to autocratic Russia's advantage. This wasn't the only time the paper has made the Munich analogy. The Post ran a piece by former George W. Bush speechwriter Mark Thiessen, headlined "On Ukraine, Biden is channeling his inner Neville Chamberlain." In the New York Times, Trump NSC aide Alexander Vindman told readers how the United States can break Putin's hold on Ukraine and urged the Biden administration to send active U.S. troops to the country. A free and sovereign Ukraine, he said, is vital in advancing U.S. interests against those of Russia and China. Times reporter Michael Crowley also framed the Ukraine standoff as another test of U.S. credibility abroad, after that credibility was supposedly damaged after ending the war in Afghanistan. In a New York Times major feature on Ukraine, the U.S. role in bringing tensions to this point was completely omitted, in favor of exclusivity, blaming Russian belligerents. As a result of this coverage, the interventionist mentality has trickled down to the public. One poll found that, should Russia actually invade Ukraine, 50% of Americans support embroiling the U.S. in yet another quagmire, up from just 30% in 2014. Biden, however, has said that no U.S. troops will be sent to Ukraine. Instead, the U.S. and EU have threatened sanctions or support for a rebel insurgency should Russia invade. The past few weeks have seen several failed talks between the U.S. and Russians, and the U.S. refuses to alter its plan to Ukraine. The U.S. Congress is rushing a lethal aid package to send more weapons to the troubled border. Perhaps if the public were better informed, there would be more domestic pressure on Biden to end the brinkmanship and seek a genuine solution to the problem. So there you have it, folks. This whole thing seems to be fueled by corporate love of money and some kind of advantage, some kind of a stronghold in the marketplace. So, as the old saying goes, follow the money. It very well applies to this.